Welcome, everyone. I am pleased to welcome you to this first session of our listening forum, which is convened by AJC's Community of Conscience Coalition. This coalition was launched in 2019 to advance shared values of pluralism, civil discourse, and mutual respect. Among the coalition's membership are top faith, ethnic, civic, and elected leaders from around the community. We unite across diverse backgrounds and perspectives to honor the American ideal as together we strive to form a more perfect union. I'd especially like to acknowledge there are a number of representatives of the city of Dallas and also Plano in attendance at these sessions, and it's truly appreciated, and I think speaks to the importance of the conversations that we're having and what we hope to learn and how that learning can translate into real systemic change. We appear to find ourselves in a watershed moment in our nation's history. The recent murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and too many other Black lives have sparked a national and even global conversation that somehow seems different than anything else we've seen in the recent past. For the first time since the civil rights era, one can sense a real opportunity for significant systemic change. In June, under the leadership of Community of Conscience members Catherine McGill, Pastor and State Representative Carl Sherman, Imam Khalid Shahid, as well as Dr. Lindsay Wilson, Interim Equity Officer for the City of Dallas, planning began on this series of listening and learning opportunities. The idea is to do a deep dive into issues of systemic racism and white supremacy that will inform future advocacy efforts. As a supplement to these sessions, our phenomenal summer intern, Carly Hacker, has put together a resource guide with suggested additional readings, bios of the panelists and moderators, and relevant statistics. You'll receive this guide in the coming days. If you haven't received it by the middle of the month, please feel free to drop us an email at dallas@ajc.org. I would also like to thank all of our Community of Conscience Coalition members, many of whom are on the call, our AJC board members, and of course, my colleagues at AJC, Assistant Director Amy Berger, and Associate Director of Regional Offices, Kim Kamen. Over our 113-year-plus history, AJC has consistently worked to advance equity, advocate for civil and human rights, and celebrate diversity. We recognize that the fight against bigotry, anti-Semitism, and hate is all of our responsibility, and are proud to convene these sessions as an important step in that process. Before I turn the program over to our moderator, please be aware that AJC is a nonpartisan 501c3 organization. We are going to ask that everyone remain muted, and if you have a question, you may email it to dallas@ajc.org. One last bit of housekeeping. In the planning of these sessions, the committee placed a high value on creating a sense of community among our attendees. So we're using the meeting format as opposed to the webinar format, which would only enable you to see the panelists. I personally have found it meaningful to toggle between the gallery view where you can see everyone and the speaker view where you see who is speaking in the moment. That way you can alternate between feeling you're part of a larger group, but also have the opportunity to focus on the speaker. You can do this by clicking where indicated in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator and speakers. Dr. Jason Shelton is Director of the Center for African American Studies at the University of Texas at Arlington. His research interests concern the sociology of religion, as well as the intersections of race, class, and attitudes about various political and social issues in contemporary America. He currently serves as the chair of the Arlington Unity Council, a major initiative sponsored by the Office of the Mayor that aims to study equity strategies that the city could implement to promote and encourage greater equality. Dr. Marvin Dulaney is Deputy Director and Chief Operations Officer for the Dallas African American Museum. He's also an Associate Professor of History Emeritus, former interim director of the Center for African American Studies at UTA, and the former chair of the Department of History at UTA as well. Finally, Bob Mong has served as president of the UNT Dallas and its College of Law. The school serves a primarily urban population that is 85% Hispanic and African American. UNT Dallas is dedicated to closing educational attainment gaps in Dallas. And he came to UNT Dallas following nearly 40 years in journalism, most of it at the Dallas Morning News, where he served as both managing editor and editor-in-chief. During his time in news leadership, the Morning News won 9 Pulitzer Prizes. It's my pleasure to turn the floor over to our moderator, Dr. Jason Shelton.
Thank you, Joel, for the introduction. And good morning, everybody. I hope you are doing well. I see lots of faces here early in the morning. So thank you all for being here. As you all know, our session today is titled "The Roots of Racism in Dallas. Changing Our Future Begins with Learning from Our Past." So I'm going to ask about 6 questions to our panelists, both of whom are esteemed historians. I told Joel months ago that I am trained as a sociologist. I know very little about the local city of Dallas's history, but these 2 gentlemen know lots. I am not from Dallas, but I am, again, a sociologist, and so I will moderate this discussion and jump in where I can to add a little bit of additional sociological perspective. So after I ask my 6 questions, then we're going to open it up to the floor for you all to join in and pose items linking the past with the present and moving the conversation forward. So to get started, our first question today, and this question is directed at both of our panelists. The question is, how would you define white supremacy? To what extent was white supremacy and racism a factor during the founding and early days of Dallas? So before our 2 panelists jump in and answer, this is an easy place for a sociologist to jump in, to explain the differences sort of in a broader perspective. If you all know, we turn on the 6 o'clock news, we hear lots about the word racism today, but it's important to explain sort of the various strains and different types of racism in a big picture. Of course, for most of us as academics, regardless of what field we study, we distinguish between personal racism and institutional racism. And the crux of this question, the idea of white supremacy, hinges on that distinction between personal versus institutional racism. Of course, when we talk about personal racism, this is our own personal beliefs as individuals, the beliefs that you and I have about those people, whoever those people are. Within the context of today's conversation, those people are people who are of a different racial or ethnic background. But of course, we can expand this discussion to include lots of isms and lots of obias, homophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, classism, sexism. So of course, it's those individual beliefs that you and I have about whoever those people are as a group. But institutional racism, on the other hand, is much broader and much more powerful in its effect in terms of systemic and institutions in our society. Some classic examples here, of course, relate to the American criminal justice system. For example, African Americans comprise 13% of the American population, but over 50% of the prison population in most states. White flight, another classic example of that. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and a great number of neighborhoods, not just back home in Cleveland, but in a great number of large cities in the 1940s and 50s or 70s even, predominantly white middle-class neighborhoods, with the passage of time would become predominantly poor and blue-collar African-American neighborhoods. How does that happen? And we can go into that at a later point, but the point here is that institutional racism is the notion that there are advantages and disadvantages to your group membership. And those things are embedded in our society, much deeply rooted, much more powerful than the names that some individual can call you. Because when someone calls us a name, I still come home to being Dr. Shelton, or I still come home to my neighborhood. Whereas institutional racism is far more powerful in its consequences that affect a broader range of people over a large period of time and instilling and reifying inequality in our society. So with that being said, we'll begin with President Robert Mong of UNT Dallas. Sir, if you can begin to take a first stab at this answer, sir, how would you define white supremacy? And to what extent was white supremacy and racism a factor in the founding of the early days of Dallas?
Thank you, Doctor. I think one way to look at it is that a person who has a perspective that white culture is superior to other cultures, to me, that's an indicator of white supremacy. I think anyone who has a fear of the dramatically changing demographic in the United States, and Texas certainly is leading the way. If you're 24 or younger in Texas, more than 60% of you are African American or Hispanic. It's the most diverse state in America. And I think there are people who are fearful of that, losing power, because that's the future of Texas. I think another indicator might be that if you prefer to live among whites, if you believe whites should have a dominance over people of other backgrounds, those are some of the definitions I would have. As far as the early days of Dallas, I think you have to look at Dallas was the greatest inland cotton market in the world in the early days. Cotton is a labor-intensive business, and the slave trade obviously made up a lot of the workforce and from the Black Belt of the Deep South through Texas. And you look at Dallas in the mid to late 1800s, a lot of the economy was dependent on cotton. I've seen statistics where 8% of the population of Dallas was one way or the other directly tied into the cotton business. So I think cotton played, an important role in establishing sort of a racial dichotomy in its early days.
Dr. Dulaney, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the conversation. Dr. Dulaney is someone who I've known for a long time and in many ways view him as a mentor. Please, sir.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Obviously, white supremacy is this erroneous notion that just because of someone's skin color, they're either inferior or superior to others. And of course, it developed over the course of time, as Mr. Mong pointed out, starting with the slave trade, and of course, especially in the antebellum era of American history, in the period between 1790 and 1860, when our country was developing, slavery was perhaps the most important institution in the country. That is, slavery and cotton production was sort of the basic foundation and source of wealth in this country. And of course, in terms of it coming to Dallas, some of the first settlers here, like William Brown Miller, the Cockrell family, were all slaveholders. They brought their enslaved people from Alabama and Tennessee and Kentucky and Arkansas in order to build their wealth, and of course, eventually to make Dallas this sort of wealthy settlement out here in a very real sense, was literally a wilderness. Well, I guess I shouldn't use that term, but an unsettled area except for Native Americans being here. And indeed, it sort of perpetuated the white supremacy and institutional racism.
Thank you very much for that answer. Dr. Dulaney, we're going to stick with you for our next question, sir.
Sure.
Oh, no, sir, excuse me. We'll go to Dr. Mong on this one. In the 1920s, President Mong, Dallas had the highest per capita membership in the Ku Klux Klan, claiming over 13,000 of Dallas's 160,000 residents, which is about 1 in 3 adult males. Why was Dallas such fertile ground for the Ku Klux Klan? And what role did the Dallas Morning News play as a counterpoint to the movement? And also along the way, can you please discuss, has the media's role in advancing racial equity and justice evolved in our community over the past 100 years?
Thank you. Well, I think the rise of the Klan was really focused a lot on Dallas because I think I'll just tell a quick story. We restored, UNT Dallas restored, with the help of the city and the state, City Hall, old City Hall. It's our law school now. And it served as City Hall from 1914 to 1978. So in those late teens, early 20s, when the Klan was alive and strong, when you look at the plaque on the wall, I walked through that about midway through the restoration with a local historian, and he pointed to the names on the plaque, and he said, he was a member of the Klan, he was a member of the Klan, he was a member of the Klan. So you can't underestimate the fact that a lot of very powerful people in the city were members of the Klan. In the, I think, early 20s, Klan Day at the State Fair. It's astonishing to think of it now, but it was true. I think the morning news, there were a number of papers in the early 20s. The morning news was started in 1885 as an extension of the Galveston News, which is the oldest continuous business in Texas, which was founded actually by a Civil War officer. And so the morning news editorial page, for reasons I don't entirely understand, but I appreciate, began to write editorials critical of the Klan, started to endorse anti-Klan activities, endorsed anti-Klan, they endorsed anti-Klan candidates throughout the early 20s, usually unsuccessfully. And then there was a huge boycott that nearly bankrupted the paper. And I'm proud of the fact that the paper hung tough. They sold the Galveston paper. They sold their antecedent paper. They put a lot of emphasis on WFA radio until the tide turned in the mid-20s. Not that the streets were lined in gold, but after that, but they did hang tough, and they're really. There was a distinction between what the position that the morning news took and position some of the other papers. There were other papers that also came out against the Klan, but I think the morning news was, was certainly the most important paper, and the fact that they did it was, a significant and I think courageous stance. As far as your second question about the role the media played, I think it's very mixed, unfortunately. I think while the news did a really good job in its position with the Klan, its history during the Civil Rights Movement, the editorial page was pretty reactionary until really the early 80s, when Rena Peterson became, when Robert Deckard and Burl Osborne put Rena Peterson in as the editorial page editor, and the editorial position changed. So I think there were, so I think the record of the paper is mixed on civil rights, strong during the Klan, not so strong during the Civil Rights Movement. Not all that unusual in the country at the time. If you look at an institution like the LA Times, it was extremely reactionary. And within that, for 100 years, there was a very famous governor's race in which the writer Upton Sinclair ran for governor. He was a Democratic candidate running against kind of a crony Republican, and the LA Times just hammered away at him. Oddly enough, people think of Hollywood today as this liberal bastion. Hollywood in those days came out against this crusading journalist and writer. So the LA Times and the movie industry really killed his candidacy. So, I mean, these old institutions have histories. If you talk to people at the New York Times, they're not proud of their position on the Holocaust in the early days. And they'll say as much. They wish they had it to do over again. Mm-hmm. But I think, when Robert Deckard took over the news, I think that you saw a very different, more investigative reporting, a change, much more moderate editorial policy, a lot more, I think there was a newspaper war, if you remember that, in the 70s, 80s, and ended in the early 90s, but a lot of great journalism came out of that. The TV stations during that time, led by Marty Haig at Channel 8, but the other stations did a lot of really good reporting. And I think we can't forget Mike Levy creating Texas Monthly. Texas Monthly was, for a while, really the vanguard of crusading journalism for a time in Texas. And when the newspapers were not as vibrant as they became in the 80s. So there were a lot of things going on during that time. But I would say it's a mixed story, but I could go on and on about it. But I think on a high level, that's my take on that. The media's role during that.
Jason, can I weigh in just a moment?
Yes, please
that
do.
Question.
Yes.
Yeah. Of course, the Klan experiences a rebirth in 1915, specifically at Stone Mountain. And so what occurs, of course, is that Dallas and Fort Worth sort of fit into what is basically a national phenomenon, in the sense of the Klan becomes real popular all across the country. And of course, they adopt stances such as being anti-immigrant, so they're very nativistic, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, and of course, anti-Black. And literally, they're trying to, as they say, reclaim the country, make the country great again. And of course, at the end of the war, they get really popular, specifically in places like Dallas and Fort Worth, because it is as if, once again, the people here seem to be more threatened. In fact, in some places, there are no Black people per se, and no Catholics, and no Mexican Americans. Yet this sort of nativistic attitude, this racist attitude, just becomes real popular among the whites in the country. one of the incidents I'd like to sort of cite just to put this on people's minds about how racism grows. Anthony Johnson was a bellhop at the Adolphus Hotel. Of course, we're all familiar with the Adolphus downtown. Anyway, he bragged publicly that he was having sexual relationships with some of the white women who were staying at the Adolphus. And of course, the Klan kidnaps him. This has happened, by the way, in 1921 here in Dallas, and whips him on the banks of the Trinity River, brands him with the letters of KKK in order to send a message. Of course, another part of this was that this is in the Cabell papers, by the way, up at SMU in the Decoya collection. Mayor Cabell wanted to find out how many members of the police department were members of the KKK. Well, he got the police chief to compile a list, and lo and behold, every member of the Dallas Police Department in 1920 was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So the stance then that the Dallas Morning News took was very, very important because they were literally going against the trend that was occurring not only in Dallas but across the country.
Wow, thank you for that insight. Those are tremendously insightful points, guys. I want to remind you all about submitting your questions. Please email them to dallas@ajc.org. dallas@ajc.org. All right. Marvin, let's continue with you, sir.
Sure.
Next question here is, explain the role of the GI Bill in creating sustainable wealth for veterans and how it may have contributed to the widening racial gap. Marvin?
Who are not familiar, the GI Bill was passed. Yes, I'm here.
Okay,
You hear me?
all right.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Did you hear my question,
Okay,
sir?
good.
Okay.
I heard your question. Yes, and I'm addressing it now. Of course, for the GI Bill was, passed by Congress at the end of World War II in order to provide veterans some advantages and some ways of reintegrating into American society. And of course, it gave them education, gave them loans. And in fact, you can still get the veterans loans, but all of this was restrictive on the basis of race. African GIs and veterans, for example, in many cases could not get the loans and the support to get training and education. I remember talking to one of the Tuskegee Airmen who pointed out that even though he knew how to fly, he could not get a job with the airlines, whereas he saw some of the other white pilots getting the jobs with the airline industry that was being sort of newly developed at the end of the war. Then, of course, this also affected housing. And as we know, housing is key to wealth in this country. African-American soldiers, GI specifically, again, not get the housing loans because most of the housing developments were being built, such as, say, Levittown in New York City, Levittown outside of Philadelphia. They were being built with the restrictions, the racial segregation restrictions that would not allow African Americans to buy houses in predominantly white housing developments. And this indeed then leads to this wealth gap between African Americans and whites. A major source of course of looking at this is Ta-Nehisi Coates' piece in the Atlantic that was published a couple of years ago, actually about 4 years ago now, about it's called The Case for Reparations, and you can look at how this develops. It increases this wealth gap, and of course promotes residential segregation in this country.
No question about it, sir. I can sort of speak to this one on a personal level. On December the 7th, 1941, my grandfather was a college student in Detroit, Michigan. And on that morning, in the African-American world, he had just become a member of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, which is the first African-American fraternity. So this is big stuff in the Black world to be initiated. And on that morning, he finds out about Pearl Harbor. And by that afternoon, he and all of his line brothers had joined the US military and went to go serve. They come back. And I just remember my grandpa and his buddies sitting around talking about how difficult it had been for them to get on their feet in the aftermath of service, of serving the country. And for my grandpa, he had it a little bit easier because he worked at a very well-known African-American owned business in Detroit at that time. And so the gentleman who ran that business, a man named C.A. Howell, put my grandpa in business in the city of Cleveland, Ohio, and said, hey, you got a lot of potential, kid. I'm going to send you to Cleveland and put you on your feet. Whereas some of his other friends who were line brothers who joined the service, they had a very difficult time because they didn't get the benefit of the GI Bill. And so they felt it was their pride that led them to go fight in the war. But when they came home, they were very upset about the disproportionate treatment that they got after putting their lives on the line to serve the country. Next question. Marvin, we're going to continue with you, sir. And you mentioned residential segregation. And I want to use that, this question as a bridge to your last point as a bridge to this next question. Can you please describe the historical roots of residential segregation in Dallas? And what are the consequences of that past residential segregation for today's world?
In Dallas, of course, right after the Civil War, many African Americans sort of migrated to Dallas from the rural areas of the state, as well as from Oklahoma and Louisiana. And they created what was called Friedman Towns around the city. There's several, Joppa, for example, Deep Ellum. Some of you will, of course, recognize Deep Ellum, Little Egypt, State Thomas. All these were these sort of historic Black neighborhoods called Friedman Towns. And they were, of course, caused by segregation, but the fact that African Americans could not live in predominantly white areas in the city. In fact, in 1916, the city passed a residential segregation ordinance, which literally said that Blacks and whites could not live in the same city blocks. There were several African Americans, however, who filed lawsuits against this ordinance. And then in 1917, the Supreme Court actually struck down a residential segregation ordinances that, prohibited African Americans from living anywhere that they wanted. Of course, then white Americans got around this then by coming up with what was called restrictive covenants. That is, they would put in the deeds of homes that a homeowner, white homeowners, could not sell the home to a Negro, a Mexican, and even a Jew, or anyone of the not of the white race. And of course, these continue on again as being part of how residential segregation was sort of set up in this city, and they're not struck down. These restrictive covenants are not struck down until 1948 in a Supreme Court case. But even with them being struck down in 1948. Residential segregation continues. Here in Dallas, of course, it's enforced by violence. When Lincoln High School was built in 1939, for example, it bordered on what then was a traditionally white neighborhood in South Dallas. And as African Americans tried to move then into the area near Lincoln High School, their homes were bombed. Eventually, the city resolved the matter by buying up the homes of these African Americans who had gotten too close to the borders of a white neighborhood. This occurs again in 1950 and 1951, where 10 homes of African Americans are bombed again here in South Dallas. And this time, the city tries to resolve the matter by creating Hamilton Park. And of course, most of you know that Hamilton Park is up northeast of Central Expressway. So that's, again, it's sort of the history of residential segregation here in Dallas and how it developed. Then, of course, we get gentrification, where the city builds, or actually the city and the state builds Central Expressway, builds that link between Central Expressway in 1935 that displaces displaces a major African-American neighborhood, specifically St. Thomas, and of course, and also parts of what was then Deep Ellum. And again, that sort of forces African-Americans out because the taxes go up in that area. And of course, it has been gentrified, where young white citizens move in. The rents literally force out, and again, force African Americans who can't pay the rents or who can't pay the taxes in that area to have to find other places to go. And again, so that's part of how communities are gentrified. Because that's how it sort of happened in Dallas. I guess I was sort of blown away, though. I guess 5 or 6 years ago, I was in New York City and I went to Harlem, and I looked at how Harlem had changed, primarily because of gentrification in that community. I can't hear you, Jason. You've muted yourself.
Oh, whoops. I'm sorry, sir.
Yeah.
125th Street in Harlem, I could not believe how gentrified it has become. I mean, my goodness. Anyway, you're exactly right. President Mong, do you want to speak to the role of gentrification here in Dallas, sir?
Yeah, I just wanted to add kind of a, I think, powerful footnote to what Dr. Dulaney said about St. Thomas. When Central was put in, I mean, I think it speaks to a state of mind that existed. There was a large cemetery there, and it was basically paved over without consideration of the people, or the families of the people who were buried there, and cut right through. Gravestones were used to fill ditches and low spots in the construction. And a lot of the Black residents were, relocated to Oak Cliff, South Dallas. And of course, the museum has had many tributes to Mamie McKnight, who restored the cemetery, and probably doesn't get the credit that she deserves in the city. But I think it just speaks to, unfortunately, to a state of mind that existed for so many years. I think the roots of the disparities between North and South Dallas are deep and go back many years. And I think it was 2003, I hired Booz Allen to work with the consulting company to work with a group of our best journalists to, it started out really to look at city governance and, how good was, how good were services, et cetera, et cetera. It sounds bland, but it was actually, it elicited a lot of strong feelings. The conclusion of this really data-driven inquiry was that the city, in those days, had stopped listening to its citizens. For budget reasons, they weren't polling citizens. They had pulled out of programs that compared themselves with other cities. Places like Phoenix and San Jose and San Diego and Seattle were benchmarking Dallas, and Dallas was not benchmarking them. And in many ways, you could look at what they found, and because the city wasn't doing it, you could learn more about what was going on in the city of Dallas from other cities and what they were gathering about Dallas. And so that was an indication to me that we needed to look deeper. Anyway, the point of that series really was that the city was not, at the time, was not operating strategically. They weren't aligning their dollars with goals. And just kind of basic stuff like that. But what really came through was a fantastic amount of outmigration from the middle class to the suburbs. And it was kind of a race to last between Houston and Dallas, who was going to lose the middle class faster. And so the city, like a lot of cities in the country, was becoming richer and poorer. And then that really led to a multi-year series that we started on the gap between the North and the South. And it's really quite extraordinary. It still is today. I mean, it is a chasm, and it unfolds in so many ways, including housing is so important, and the history of redlining is so important, not just here but all over the country. And so, I mean, I could speak more about the gap, but frankly, it's such a paradoxical city in so many ways. It's such a gleaming city, and yet, and #1 job market before COVID in the country, and so many great things to say about it. But at the same time, 41% of the families, households in Dallas are run by single parents, which is often an early indicator, a leading indicator of poverty. I think we're 3rd in child poverty. And thank God for the Child Poverty Action Lab and some of the important work that they're doing right now to try to come up with solutions. But it really is a story of 2 cities in many regards. And if you look at things like educational attainment, again, the more money your parents make, the more likely you are to get a degree. The more likely you are to get a degree, the more, there's $1 million lifetime earning premium if you have a bachelor's degree than if you don't. And that crosses all ethnic and racial and class lines. If you can get there, it makes a huge difference. And then you look at, and these are national statistics too, there's a famous Nobel laureate named Angus Deaton who discovered that these, what he calls these diseases of deaths of despair, suicide, alcoholism related, drug related, the numbers per 100,000 are astronomically higher for those who don't have a bachelor's degree, don't have, only have a high school diploma. And so this stuff plays out all over the country, but it also plays out here in very tangible ways.
Well, I said at the outset that we had 6 questions that we were going to pose to our panel, but these gentlemen and their knowledge, they have interwoven their answers together so well that I'm out of questions now, which is a great thing.
Well, can I do a shameless plug?
Yes, sir, please do.
Yeah, since Bob mentioned Friedman Cemetery, which of course was disrupted and literally torn up by Central Expressway, the installation of Central Expressway starting in I guess 1950-51 when Central was first built. As a result, though, of them widening Central Expressway, I guess in 91, 92, they of course rediscovered some of the graves of the people who had been buried there. In fact, altogether, I guess it was about 1,500 graves that were discovered and moved. But the shameless plug is, as a result of that, we were able to do an exhibition here at the African American Museum called Facing the Rising Sun, which tells the history of the State Thomas community, and of course uses some of the artifacts that were taken from Friedman Cemetery to tell the story of this historic African American community that developed at the turn of the 20th century, and of course, as I said, lasted up until the 70s when it was finally sort of uprooted. So that's my shameless plug. Then of course, let me also then note and add to what Bob is saying about the contrasts in this city. Black Enterprise Magazine used to do an annual column about the best cities for Blacks. 5 years in a row, Dallas finished 5th or 6th in terms of being one of the best cities for Blacks. But as Bob points out, yet there's this great contrast between South Dallas and North Dallas, and this contrast in terms of wealth and income in this city, even among African Americans. Though, as he points out, those with college degrees do very well, whereas those who don't have college degrees, are part of the low income community, who don't have the health care, who can barely afford the rents in the city. And Jason, with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Oh, very good, sir. No problem. I appreciate the plug. It's important to let the folks know what's the great work that's going on at the museum. And also with that, Joel, let me, one more reminder, folks, if you have questions, please email them to dallas@ajc.org. And we're ready to take some questions from the floor, Joel.
Great, and we do have a couple of questions. First of all, from AJC Dallas past president Adam Lampert, who asks, different cities have had different responses to addressing systemic racism. Which city or region is getting it right? What are they doing that is notable? And just to add an addendum to that, the Dallas County Commission recently voted unanimously to declare racism a public health crisis. Is the public health angle a good way to proceed in the fight against systemic racism?
Well, I'll take a stab at the last part of your question. I think this long-running racial inequities in the country have really been exploited by the coronavirus because the pandemic has really fallen unevenly and has hit disproportionately African American and Hispanic people and poor people in general. So I think in that sense, that's been one of the striking examples of inequities that is so pronounced right now through this pandemic.
Well,
Marvin, go on, sir.
Am I cutting you off, Bob?
No, sir. Go on, Marvin.
Okay. In terms of a city getting it right, I'd have to say Atlanta. And I'm going to have to keep this brief because these are two very different and long stories, but both of the stories sort of center around political and economic power. Dallas, from my research, didn't do it right in terms of sharing political and economic power from the 1930s up through the 1970s. And that's why we had these crazy conflicts in the 1980s where John Wiley Price is still protesting in the streets and trying to shut the city down in the 1980s. In contrast to Atlanta, where they, of course, African Americans had to fight for political power, but eventually they were able to share it, begin to control the city politically in terms of the city council and the mayor, and in addition, the economic power, building the Atlanta airport, for example, in the southwest part of the city, which is a majority African American community. Maynard Jackson coming in and literally creating African American millionaires in the city by sharing economic power in the city with African Americans. So again, it's a much more detailed story than what I'm doing. I'm just sort of doing a summary of what happened in Atlanta versus what happened here in Dallas.
When Joel introduced me, he mentioned that I chair the Arlington Unity Council, which is effectively our racial task force in the city. And it has come about in response to City Council here in Arlington passed several resolutions related to racial differences, recognizing that with COVID-19 and in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, a number of things. There's a great resolution recognizing inequality in the city overall. And all of these things sort of led to the Unity Council. In the month since, I have been reading tons of racial equity reports in ways that I've never read them before, right? And seeing them as they've been produced by various cities. There are things that I think what's really important is that different cities, as you all know this, different parts of our country are very different in their lifestyle and their approach and their view to politics. You've got to be specific for your region of the country and what's capable, what you can pull off in your city versus in other cities. And I think we have to be pragmatic in that approach. So for example, for Los Angeles's report, I think is amazing. There's a lot of tremendous detail, and some of the things that they've done out of LA, a very large and diverse city, I think are really interesting. A close buddy of mine serves on city council in the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And Rob and I went to school in college, Robert Lavelle. And Rob in Pittsburgh, they recognized racism as a public health problem. And they did this 10 years ago. And Rob has led the fight with police use of force policies in the city and city council there, and a whole host of other things. The role of, chief diversity officers in cities. Different cities have taken different approaches. And I think what works in one place may not work in another place because of its politics, its sensibilities. All of those things have to be brought into play. But I agree with what Marvin said about Atlanta. I like what I saw in LA. Definitely like what I see in Pittsburgh, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll work here in DFW or that they'll work here in Arlington. And so you've got to find a way to move the dial forward in addressing issues of inequality and poverty, but we have to be recognized what works locally and what may not work locally, particularly in the modern day.
One thing that I think is going really well here is those of you who are familiar with the Commit Partnership. It's a coalition of probably 200 institutions, businesses, school districts, colleges. And Todd Williams, who created it at the request of the Mayor Rawlings. When you look at the work of Commit and its annual report card and the data that they're creating to really shine a light on where we stand as far as how we're educating our children. They look at if you haven't been aware of Commit, I think it's worth going on their website and looking at the 12 indicators that they've created, from participation in full day pre-K to living wage. And they've been extremely influential here. Other Commit-like organizations now have sprung up in Houston, in San Antonio, in Austin, and now in Tarrant County, Fort Worth. So it is a force for, growing awareness to educational disparities with lots of constructive actions to begin to address it. And every school district in the county is very aware of how they're doing in those 12 indicators. And there's going to be an announcement soon on a program called Dallas Thrives, which was organized by Commit and by the Dallas Regional Chamber to really attack the issue of living wage in Dallas County. Almost shockingly, the statistics that have come out of, I was on a small task force that helped create Dallas Thrives, and the statistics surprised me even. In Dallas County, this is not just the city, the whole county, only 5 of 20 early wage earners, 25 to 34, make $50,000 or more, 5 out of 20. And if you're African American, it's less than 5. And if you're Hispanic, Latinx, it's less than 5. And so the goal is to double that number. And so these organizations are very important. I would say there's hardly anything like Commit in the country. There are a few, but it's something I think we can be proud of, and I think, and it's leading to a lot of positive change. They certainly were the precursors and the thought leaders around, House Bill 3 that changed the formula for pre-K to 12 education in the state. So that's a positive note.
So we have time for one final question, and we do want to end on a positive note. And I think this will also allow some space to build on the discussion of Dallas Thrives. But even though this is a panel on history, I want us to look forward. And do we think Dallas is becoming a more equitable city? And I would expand that to the surrounding outlying suburbs as well. Are we expanding equity? What are the stumbling blocks? And what have some of our positive achievements been? And what role can our audience members play in advancing racial equity here in our community?
Marvin, you want to go first? I saw
Sure.
you ready.
I'd say, even though it's 20 years late, maybe 30 years late, that Dallas is becoming a more equitable city. I think it's very positive that politics have become, and again, I'm trying to be somewhat apolitical here, that politics in the city have become more equitable. You see African Americans serving as judges, and African Americans and Mexican Americans serving as judges and city council persons and county commissioners, and so you do see an entry into what used to be a very exclusive area in the city in terms of political participation. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done economically. Again, Bob cited the fact that there's still this economic differential between North Dallas and South Dallas, and that is something that the city needs to address. And I think those who have the economic power in the city need to reach out, support African American businesses, hire more African American, Mexican Americans in positions that are beyond just minimum wage. And I think, let's just say, I think the attitude, at least now, is right. That before there was a fight between blacks, whites, and browns in the city over who was going to control the power in the city. But I think now there's more attitude that basically we need to share power, that everybody should be able to participate and benefit from the wealth that is generated in this city. And I'll stop there.
I would say I'm very hopeful. I think being president of UNT Dallas, our students are constantly inspiring me. And when you look, and most of them are first generation, most of them come from very modest households. Their parents are supportive, but most of them have not been to college, so they can't offer that counsel. And yet these students are incredibly loyal to their families and also ambitious. And I'll give you an example of one of our, because maybe a couple examples, but Jaime Resendez is on the city council. He's on the school board. And Jaime grew up in Pleasant Grove. He served, 2 terms in, I think, Afghanistan, maybe Iraq. And he came back and he went to Eastfield College. I mean, this is such a typical story for our students. And of course, you all know he ended up eventually, he graduated from UNT Dallas and went on to UT Law School, a great law school. when he was at, he told me that when he was at Eastfield, he wasn't even sure what a lawyer was. Then he ended up going to one of the top 20 law schools. I mean, I think it's just, there's so many stories like that are emerging now. One of our students, we have a good public health program, and one of our students, a daughter of two servers in a Mexican restaurant. She graduated from Columbia Public. She graduated with high honors from UNT Dallas, was heavily recruited by Columbia's public health program, and is now on her way. She's graduated, she's got a great job. Her parents did not want her to leave Dallas. It took a lot of courage for her to go, and it's a very typical story. Another young man is on his way to Johns Hopkins, one of the great public health schools in the country. They're inspired by the public health crisis today, and they want to make a difference. So I see it all the time with our students, and you know, where they balance that closeness they have with their family with their ambition to do better. And I think one thing I worry about, you know, our vision statement at UNT Dallas is to be a pathway to socioeconomic mobility. And we put that together 5 years ago, shortly after I got there, because it's not a given in today's America. America lags the modern world, the developed world in social and economic mobility. And I think universities like UTA and UNT Dallas and the community colleges and the 27 other regional universities in Texas, they're the ones that are going to make a difference for these higher poverty students who are very smart. They need a chance. And if they get that degree, they will do better. And I think that's why I'm very hopeful. I think demographics don't lie. And I think the state is going to be a very different place 10 years from now.
Let me just add a couple of real quick points here. Again, I'm not from Dallas, so I can't speak to where the city was personally. I can speak to where it is now in terms of this general area, but in a bigger perspective, I always tell my students, my grandparents were from Birmingham, Alabama, which was essentially the belly of the beast when it comes to the civil rights movement. I showed them a documentary called Citizen King. I highly recommend it to all of you all to go see. And there's a point in the documentary where the question is, do we go to Birmingham? And because when you go to Birmingham, it's going to be on if we go protest in Birmingham. And of course, Dr. King says we go to Birmingham because if we win in Birmingham, we'll win everywhere else. And so that's where my grandparents are from. And I can tell you that before my grandpa died, to watch him be in tears because the world that his grandboys would grow up in, particularly on the night of watching the first African-American president be elected, would be, he could never have foreseen that in the arc of his life. Now, we've come a long way, but we do have a long way to go, no question about it. And so when Marvin talks about Dallas as a city, particularly, I remember years ago looking at Black enterprise like, yo, Dallas is the place to be. Black folks must be doing it big in Dallas. And we are. And it's one of the reasons why my wife and I enjoy living in this area so much. I showed data just the other night to the Arlington Unity Council that showed that nationally, local African Americans here in Arlington have a higher median household income than African Americans nationally. There are also fewer of us in poverty here in Arlington than as compared to national data. Those are good signs. It's the exact opposite for the Latino community here in Arlington. And as we see here for whites in Arlington, it tracks with national data, making about $70,000 total household income. But we also do have a higher percentage of whites who live below the poverty line than nationally. So it's an interesting and unique story in a lot of ways. That being said, I want to go back to something Marvin said. And that is, we cannot lose sight of the role of poverty. Even though there is the good news of the success of middle-class African Americans in this part of the country and in this city, we cannot lose sight of the fact that so many Black folks and brown folks and white folks are desperately poor and stuck in poverty, and there are few viable pathways out. And that's why so many of us as middle-class people, Black folks in particular, we love to pat ourselves on the back of how far we've come and how hard we've worked and how much we've done. And we have, there's no question about it, but we cannot lose sight of the fact that so many of us, Black, brown, and white, and Asian, are stuck below the poverty line with few opportunities to climb out. We cannot forget that, because if we are going to live up to our potential as a nation, and this notion of the American dream being accessible to all, it cannot just be to those people who are comfortably in the middle class. So Joel, I want to thank you, sir, for the opportunity today. I want to thank the panel again today, and I'm handing the floor back to you, sir.
Thank you, and thank you to Dr. Shelton, Dr. Dulaney, President Mong, and to each and every one of you who has come to participate in this conversation today. And again, it is, the learning is but an important step in the process, but it's not the end. We look forward to continuing in this work together. Our next session, next Tuesday morning, also at 8, will be The View from the Pulpit, and will feature Community of Conscience Coalition members Imam Khalid Shahid and Pastor Carl Sherman, as well as Reverend Michael Waters, and will be moderated by my colleague, AJC New Jersey Regional Director, Rabbi David Levy. So we'll look forward to that, look forward to seeing you then. And in the meantime, you should expect that resource guide most likely before the next session, and we look forward to another vibrant conversation next week. Goodbye, everybody.